Hi everyone, welcome to March's In Conversation With. We've got a really good chat and discussion topic lined up for you guys today. So just to introduce the ICW platform, we essentially highlight the work of climate activists, organisations and tradition here in the UK. So we hope that through showcasing these community members and more and more people will feel inspired to join in fighting this important cause. And we want to create conversations and dialogue about the climate crisis within our community, which is you. So to introduce our wonderful speaker today, this is Jo, who joined Green Alliance as a policy advisor in January 2020, where she focuses on working with politicians and policymakers to bring about a transition to a low carbon society. Previously, Jo worked at Policy Connect as a research and policy manager and has also worked in policy and advocacy in other roles, including the climate and energy team at the WWF, which is amazing, if I can just add. She also holds a master's in chemistry from the University of Nottingham. So Jo, welcome to ICW.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, really happy to have you as well. It's going to be a great conversation. So focusing on the theme of this month, which is transport and what the UK is doing about it, I thought it'd be good to maybe start out by setting a bit of context. So how transport perhaps contributes to environmental problems in general.
Yeah, sure. I guess probably it makes sense just to start off with climate change, just because I guess that's the general topic of this conversation, and looking at the UK obviously as the main focus. But if we're thinking about transport in general, it's the kind of highest emitting sector in the UK for emissions. So it contributes about 35%. So that's over a third of the UK's transport emissions every year. And that's all different modes. So we're looking at cars, buses, trains, planes, ships, everything. It commits around a third. And within that, cars are kind of the largest source of emissions. So they contribute about half of the whole of transport's emissions every year. So and then following that is kind of HGVs and vans and stuff. So really the way that we get around on the roads are the kind of largest source of emissions in the UK. And I think it's worth just putting that in the context of like the rest of the decarbonisation of the UK's economy, because the UK has actually been relatively successful in decarbonising its economy in the last 30 years. I think we've cut our emissions by about 40% since 1990. And most of those emissions cuts have come from the power sector and the waste sector. So in the power sector, we've kind of got rid of coal use for electricity and replace that with renewables. And in the waste sector, we've been sending a lot less waste to landfill. So those two sectors together have basically provided all of the emissions cuts. So in comparison, the transport sector has essentially made like no progress towards decarbonisation. Yeah. In fact, it's basically emitting the same amount of emissions as it did 30 years ago. So yeah, I think it's good to see that comparison and that transport's a bit not doing great in the UK in terms of emissions cutting. So that's the emission side of things. Then there's some other, obviously, like other environmental problems from transport as well. The most obvious one, exactly, the most obvious one being air pollution. So like, I guess air pollution causes lots of like problems with human health. So things like cancer, diabetes, strokes, asthma, those sorts of things. And I think it's been linked to about 40,000 deaths every year for people in the UK. So it's like a really big problem. And I think about 75% of areas already breach laws that have been set in terms of like what the safe levels of air pollution are in the UK. So yeah, it's a massive health problem basically, and most of the emissions that cause poor air quality come from transport in city centres and local and kind of town centres as well. So essentially, transport has a really big environmental impact, not just because of climate change, but also because of air pollution as well.
Yeah, no, definitely, completely agree. I think it's like it's like one of the areas that definitely emits a lot, and there's like a massive amount of sort of like knock-on effects, not just direct emissions, but like you mentioned, like health and stuff. And I know that there are like specific transport modes. I thought it might be good to maybe cover those for a little bit, and maybe how they contribute to climate change and how this sort of changed over the last decade, because I know we've made like improvements in the different types of transport we have, you know, with like progression of like electric vehicles and things like that. So it might be good just to explore that a bit. So like, you know, how they contribute and how it's changed over the past couple of years.
Yeah, sure. Sure. I thought maybe it'd be useful to kind of talk to this, imagine if we are taking a kind of imaginary journey from like, say, where I live now, which is in Bristol, to Edinburgh. Like if you wanted to go in the most carbon efficient way, what would be the best, and then the least as well. So I think obviously the best way, if you had a spare 2 weeks to get there, would be walking and cycling. That's obviously the lowest emissions. And obviously that isn't probably the best way unless you did have a lot of spare time. I'm sure it would be a very nice ride or walk. But obviously that's the lowest in terms of emissions. And I think it's just worth saying in terms of trends for walking and cycling, although in the last year, because of the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in the number of people who are walking and cycling because it's like a safe way to get around. Actually, other than that, there hasn't really been a very positive trend towards how much people are walking and cycling. Like we basically walk and cycle the same as we did 10 years ago, for example. And if you're looking at trips that you could walk and cycle, so say like under 2 miles, most of those are still done in a car. So I think, yeah, that's an interesting thought about how we can move those transport modes to move people from using the car for under 2 mile trips to walking and cycling. So yeah, obviously walking and cycling is the most carbon efficient. Then the next is public transport, so trains and buses. So trains are basically the best if you're looking at public transport. I think trains are about half the carbon emissions of buses. And so obviously if you're thinking about getting to Edinburgh, then you'd want to use the train basically. Then in the middle we have cars. So how green cars are to use basically depend on the type of car that you have and also like how you're using it. So if you're driving an electric car, for example, that's actually like quite low carbon. It's about the same amount of carbon as a train. So if you're driving that to Edinburgh, then that's as if you were going in a train in terms of emissions. But then the other stuff that's quite interesting is that petrol cars, say you're in like a small petrol car and you've got 2 passengers, so there's 3 of you in the car, then that's actually around the same amount of emissions as a bus. So it's actually, it's like still fairly good for emissions. But on the other hand, if you're in like bigger cars, a car that's that's powered by diesel, or if you don't have many passengers, actually that can be really bad for the environment. And in fact, if you're like driving like a big SUV on your own all the way to Edinburgh that's powered by diesel, then actually that might be worth, or kind of similar to if you were flying. So yeah, cars is quite interesting. It changes a lot depending on like what type of car you're using and how many people you have in it and that sort of thing. So yeah, and yeah, I think it's interesting with cars actually because we're actually around the kind of like size of cars, because we're actually driving less than we were 20, 30 years ago. But the emissions from cars in general have been going up. And part of that is because there's, the population of the UK has been going up, but partly it's also because we're all using like kind of, it's become fashionable to have like really much bigger cars. So everyone wants like Jeeps or SUVs, big 4-wheel drives, that sort of thing. They've become really cool. But that means that we all have these like massive cars that are actually really inefficient, and we're kind of driving them in, I'm sure you'll see them, particularly if you're in like affluent areas in like London, for example, you see people driving them around when they don't really need them. But just because they're seen as like the fashionable choice at the moment, and it means that emissions from cars have actually been going up in the last few years, which is interesting trend, I think.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, it's a bit of a worrying trend, I think. I think especially if like you have big cars and like you said before, not enough people to fill them. So like you're one person producing all of these emissions from this big car, and it's just you traveling.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas like if you had a smaller car and you had some passengers in there, then actually that's already, you can still drive, and it's way better for the environment. So I think people often miss that as being actually quite a good way to cut emissions, is literally just having passengers and having an efficient car, even if it's powered by petrol. So yeah. And then, I guess the worst, just coming on to the worst way, say on this hypothetical journey from Bristol to Edinburgh, would obviously be for flying. But particularly, Actually, like long haul flights, so we're not talking about Edinburgh here, but if you're flying to Australia, it's actually relatively efficient, but it's essentially you burn like the most emissions when you're taking off and landing in a plane. So essentially the shorter distance that you're flying, the worse it is over like per kilometer, I guess, for the environment. So essentially short haul flights and domestic flights are just not very good for the environment. So that would be the worst thing. But yeah, I guess it's interesting to say as well on aviation is that we are all flying a lot more than we were like even 20 years ago, particularly short haul flights to like Spain, like North Europe, we're all flying a lot more than we used to, and that's obviously had a big impact on emissions. So yeah, it's interesting to see. I guess that again has been like holiday, people have become more used to taking short haul flights for holidays and stuff like that, whereas before they might have just stayed in the UK or taken a ferry or something. So yeah,
I think that's also like the attraction of sort of going away and like I guess the cheapness of flights, and I think that also links in, you know, quite nicely with the cut in air passenger duty and sort of the implicit kind of encouragement to fly more, which is a bit worrying, especially for things like short haul flights, like you mentioned, which are less efficient.
Exactly. Yeah, so the government, exactly. The government has they're announcing that that's what they'd like to do. They're consulting on it at the moment. So it's like, in a way, you can kind of, the reason that they're trying to do that is because they're trying to improve connectivity with Scotland and sort of Wales and stuff. But I do think it's very odd that they're basically making it cheaper to use the most polluting form of transport, basically, whilst like train fares have been rising and will rise this year again. And yeah, it's a very odd choice, I think, but I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that in a bit.
No, exactly. No, but that was a really really helpful sort of discussion there on like the more specific transport modes and their effects. I thought sort of like nicely moving on from that, it might be good to sort of talk about what the government is doing to decarbonise transport, because I know there's like a lot of different policy announcements going, you know, here and there, lots of different news reports coming out. So I thought it might be useful for the people watching, for us to go through some of those announcements and, you know, see exactly what's going on.
Yeah, sure. I think the main thing to say first as a bit of context is just that this government in particular, but maybe all governments in a way, really like a technological fix for climate. And so yeah, exactly. So they like technology that's low carbon and that kind of allows you to live a similar life to what you're living now, but just in a more low carbon way, which you can understand as a politician why you'd want that, not kind of forcing people to change. But in that context, in terms of transport, this government's really keen on electric vehicles, essentially. So electric vehicles obviously essentially are the same as petrol and diesel cars, except instead of having an engine, you have a battery which you charge from a charging point or straight from your house. So you can still continue to live the kind of life that we do now, but from you know, using electric vehicles rather than petrol and diesel. So in terms of what the government's been doing there, the most obvious thing, which you probably will have seen, is that they announced at the end of last year that from 2030, you won't be able to buy new petrol or diesel cars anymore in the UK. And similarly, from 2035, you won't be able to buy new hybrid cars anymore. So hybrid cars are ones that have both engines and batteries in them. So it's things like the Priuses, for example, are the earliest versions, but also now we have plug-in hybrids to like, I can't remember any options off my head, but anyway, they're quite common with cars at the moment. So essentially that is actually quite exciting, because it basically means that over the next decade, we're going to see a really big increase in electric cars in the UK, particularly because, I mean, at the moment, they're probably quite expensive for normal people to buy, but we are going to see a lot of like, for example, business fleets and or like government-owned fleets like emergency services, probation services, that sort of thing, will all start to turn electric. And at some point when they outlive their usefulness as part of the government fleets, and they'll then pass into secondhand markets and other people will be able to buy them. So I think we're really, in the next sort of 5 years, we're really going to start seeing a huge number of electric vehicles on our streets, which is quite cool. And then I guess in terms of what the government's doing to actually support that, I guess the main thing is around charging infrastructure. So really trying to make sure that there's like high there's lots of charging points in service stations, so you can charge your car in sort of 25-30 minutes, and also helping people who don't have driveways to be able to charge easily, because at the moment you basically have to charge like from your house, like on your drive. But if you don't have a drive, then they're kind of come up with solutions like charging from street lamps, or having like little bollards where you can just like put your car in, charge your car from that. So yeah, there's that sort of stuff that's going on, and then also various like tax incentives and stuff with electric vehicles. So really, yeah, sorry.
That's really interesting. No, sorry. We just had a question come in on EVs actually, just asking what are your thoughts on EVs and the depletion of precious metals like lithium to produce them? And do you think there has to be a trade-off? So slightly in a different direction, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that. I'm happy to repeat the question as well if you need to.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the most interesting questions about electric vehicles. And it's not just lithium, also cobalt as well, and various other rare earth metals. Essentially, yeah, we have to increase our consumption of them a lot to be able to supply electric vehicles. I think, and obviously part of that, there are problems with mining. There's like there can be huge environmental problems with mining, particularly lithium, but also human rights abuses as well. I think it's like 80% of all of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's like child labor, human rights abuses going on. Like, how can we? It feels at the moment like there could be a trade-off between mining the materials we need from those sorts of countries and like providing decarbonisation. But having said that, I actually don't think there could be a trade-off unless we kind of act now to make sure that our supply chains they don't have to come from those countries. They don't have to use those damaging methods for mining. So I think the first thing to say is that like battery technology is like improving all the time. So we have to use less resources like lithium and cobalt. So the ones that we were using even like 5 years ago used way more materials than they do now, and they will use less in 5 years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we should be recycling them. Like at the moment, our recycling in the UK and the EU as well is just not good enough in any way. Whereas like if we were actually recycling EV stuff properly, we could get like 50% of the cobalt that we need in 2035 just from recycling car batteries properly. So we need to really like get that stuff in place. And then the other thing is it really does come down to like putting in place really strong due diligence on supply chains of companies who are making EV batteries and making EVs, and just making sure that where they're sourcing their materials from doesn't contribute towards like other environmental problems with mining, but also with like human rights abuses and other social problems from that. But I think it's like such an interesting topic, and I feel like it hasn't quite been addressed yet by politicians who are really pushing the electric vehicle revolution.
Definitely, I agree. I think like sort of separately, that I think there is work being done like at a government level to ensure sustainability in supply chains going forward. But I think that's definitely something that we need to be taken into account, as we sort of are encouraging people to buy more electric vehicles, like looking at where batteries, like how the materials are being sort of mined and made, is I think definitely something that we need to look at.
And there's also, just to say, like there's also, as well as like current where lithium, for example, is currently mined, they're also looking at new mines, for example, in Portugal, in Cornwall, also in like the Atacama Desert in like Bolivia and Peru. Like there are these new places they're looking to mine. And I think that since they're thinking about mining now, it's like this is the time to really try and be looking at what those environmental impacts are and trying to minimize them if possible, or work out if we need them at all and if we can just be recycling what we already have. I think we should be thinking about that now rather than in the future being like, oh no, we're using all this lithium, or we didn't
like solving that problem there.
Exactly.
I think that's like a really good point. We've had like 2 more questions come in, which I think will be good to sort of round off discussing what the government has done to decarbonise transport. And then I think after those questions, we can talk about the gaps in transport policy, because I know there are quite a few. But yeah, so the questions that we've had come in, the first one is, how has COVID and working from home affected emissions, which I think we might have addressed earlier, but we can also talk about that again. And then the second question is, what is expected to happen to the transport sector post-lockdown?
Cool. Yeah, I guess they're quite linked in a way. So I
Yeah.
think the transport sector has been one of the hardest hit from the pandemic. I mean, we've seen like in the first pandemic, I think like bus and train use went down by like 90% or something compared
Wow,
to the
that's
year before. It was
really
absolutely huge. And rail use has stayed very low. Bus use has climbed a bit, I guess, in through lockdown as people like have got back onto it and stuff, but people tend to be traveling within cities but not between cities as much, which is why bus use has stayed the same. Well, has grown a bit. It's still much below where it was. So bus and train use has gone down hugely. As I said before, cycling and walking has gone up a lot, particularly in the summer months when it was nice and sunny, maybe a bit less over the winter. But yeah, they've gone up a lot, and government have been quite keen to try and capitalise on that and try and get people to be walking and cycling more and make that, mean that people start realise that cycling's actually really fun and really easy, and then incorporate it more into their daily routines than they did before COVID. In terms of, so car use also fell during the first wave of the pandemic, but it's now basically back to where it was before. So essentially it basically means that people have moved into using cars more than they did before to move around, because obviously overall people are traveling less, but if car use is back to where it was before, it means a lot of the journeys that would have been done on public transport have been replaced by cars. And that does actually, I mean, that kind of makes sense in a way, because a private car feels a lot safer than public transport in terms of the pandemic. But I think it's a big worry though, like for the next stage as we open up, because it's like, will people get back on public transport, or will they just keep
that
using?
sort of almost psychological aspect of, is it
Exactly.
safe, has it been sanitized, that kind of thinking, I think will probably persist a bit.
Exactly, like people will, there's a big worry that people will still see it as not being safe, but also that, like, if you started getting used to using your car and you're like, oh, this is really convenient, I don't know, like you don't have to wait for the bus or whatever it is, like you might just start being like, oh, I'm just going to keep driving my kids to school or driving to the shop or whatever. And so yeah, I think there's a big worry with that, and also it's a big worry for like for public transport users as operators as well, because they're worried that at the moment they're basically being propped up by the government, like the government's providing lots of loans to bus operators.
Everything opens up.
Yeah, exactly. So like for all the buses and the railways, like will they be able to operate now? And at the moment the government is actually in control of all of those, so like will they ever go back to their kind of commercial owners? Like there's a lot of big unanswered questions really. And particularly, yeah, as the question around working from home, I think around half of the people in the UK have worked from home a couple of days a week at the moment. So yeah, I think it's going to remain to be seen what happens when we can all get back into the workplace, like how those will change. But presumably it will be lower than it was before, because presumably at least some people will want to work from home some of the time. So yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see what the trends happen and what that means for emissions, because yeah, emissions last year were lower than I think it was 9% lower overall, which wasn't just because of transport, it's also because of reduced economic activity too. But the fact that emissions were lower, it's like, yeah, now what's going to happen this year? I think is just going to be great to see. Really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be good to sort of maybe like look at the gaps in transport policy now, and then we've got a few more questions that are coming in as we speak, so we can always address this afterwards. But yeah, so obviously a lot of policy announcements, a lot of things going on, but there are obviously gaps and areas where the government maybe hasn't quite thought about things in transport policy, or areas maybe where they're not willing to address things. So I thought it would be good maybe if we just sort of go over a couple of the major gaps.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I think just the first major gap that I think is quite interesting is, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, saying that the kind of government loves the low carbon technology fix for things. I think the big major area that I see as being something that government hasn't really got a hold on yet is around like reducing the need to travel at all. And there's a number of different reasons why we need that. I think firstly, it's actually just for emissions. Like even if we shift to EVs as fast as the government is envisaging at the moment, and from 2030 you can't buy a new petrol and diesel car, you can still buy a secondhand one in like 2035, 2040. So there is still going to be, and people will still be driving petrol and diesel cars right up to 2050. So it's like there's still a lot of emissions associated with those cars kind of like locked into the system. And so we actually still need to be driving cars less to hit our emissions targets, even if we shift to EVs really fast. So there's that. There's also just like the other environmental issues with cars, like EVs don't solve problems with like congestion. They don't solve problems with like light and noise pollution. And even though they produce less air pollution than petrol and diesel cars, they do still produce like particulates from brakes and stuff like that. So basically, EVs don't solve all the environmental problems. And so there basically just needs to be much wider thinking around like how we can make it so that people can live the lives they want to live, but not have to jump in a car and drive miles to do that. And I think there's like some really, like, part of that just comes down to like planning. At the moment, developers can build new houses and even new like communities, like garden villages and stuff, that don't have provisions like shops or doctors or schools, and they don't have routes like bus routes and train routes to help you move around and do what you want to do in your life. So like there needs to be a lot more thinking about like how to make it so that like you have everything you need within like a 15-minute cycle or a 15-minute walk or something, which I think is interesting. And then there's other barriers as well around like, you know, active travel, for example, like cycling. At the moment, loads of people don't cycle because they don't think it's safe. And so like, I think there's a really big role for government and local governments as well in terms of like building cycling infrastructure, which is segregated, it's off the road, like people can use it conveniently. And also it's not just about like getting into the center of cities really quickly, because at the moment it's mostly just built around that, like helping people move from the suburbs to their place of work in the center, but that only serves like a small amount of the community. It doesn't serve like loads of people just, you know, take their kids to school or go to the shops or go to other places of work on the suburbs. And cycling infrastructure basically like isn't for them. Also there's like all this like bikeability stuff to kind of train people up and make them feel more confident on the road, and that's offered through schools, but maybe it could be offered through communities as well to like help more people feel confident on bikes. And there's also issues with like public transport as well. You know, rail is so expensive, buses like aren't always convenient. There's basically there needs to be a lot more like wider and longer term thinking from government, like how to get people out of their cars.
Yeah, exactly. That actually feeds really nicely into one of the latest questions that we've received. So it's basically following on from your point about trains being expensive. So trains are seen as one of the most efficient modes of transport, but how can they be made more accessible to groups such as students and young people, as it's relatively expensive for them? Like, I know, for example, people traveling from university, you know, I would see, you know, if I didn't get a ticket maybe like a month in advance or something, it'd be like super expensive if I wanted to like go home next week, if you didn't have a rail card, for example. So like I'd be sort of really interested to hear your thoughts on how it could be made a bit more accessible.
Yeah, sure. And I think the first case is that particularly for groups like students and for like people who are under 18 or under 25, like not just having rail cards, but like having like much more heavily subsidized rail travel is like amazing for helping people move around and like achieve the opportunities that are like available to them, rather than having to do it all in a car. But I think part of it does come down to like subsidy and like where government money is going at the moment. So at the moment there's quite a lot of taxation on cars, and some of the subsidy goes into public transport, but I wonder if it could be better worked like that, so that all of the money that's raised from car taxation goes into like general spending by the government, but maybe it could be more strongly directed towards railways to help subsidize some types of tickets. But yeah, in the end, it's a tricky one, and I think it's also a problem because, as I said before, like rail fares are rising this year, again, even though you know, compared to like air travel, which is the taxes on it are being cut. So yeah, I think it's again something that government needs to be looking at more closely if they really want people to travel. And you know, it's not without precedent in other countries. Like was it Sweden recently? Like I can't remember which country. Some forward-looking EU country has made like all their public transport in one of their cities completely free, and it's just like basically solved loads of the issues with congestion in the center of the cities, because like everyone's like, oh, it's free, I'm going to use public transport, I'm not going to use my car. So like I think that there can, if there's a bit more like bold thinking about how to get people to use public transport, then like people will use it. It's just making it work, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a really good point, and definitely something to think about. I think like, and I think another gap that sort of springs to mind is maybe like the sort of thinking about the point of EVs, maybe the support for EVs. So maybe like how to make sure they're accessible for those who can't afford like the current price range. You know, I'd sort of be really interested to hear your thoughts around like where the gaps are, because I know like to maybe the ordinary person who's just following the news casually, maybe they haven't seen sort of where government support or support generally is for people in sort of, you know, acquiring an EV and sort of transitioning to that.
Yeah, sure. And I think so at the moment, buying a new EV is still more expensive than buying a new petrol and diesel car in terms of upfront costs. So, and I mean, even that, like new cars are really expensive, so they are already like out of range of like most people. And but having said that, I think the costs of batteries in particular have come down a lot in the last few years. And so it's meant if you're looking at like overall lifetime costs of an electric vehicle versus petrol and diesel cars, they are actually cheaper, because there's like, it's cheaper to charge your car from electricity than it is to fill it with petrol. There's like various tax incentives and stuff that make it cheaper. So, but obviously most people don't really think about lifetime costs. They do mostly think about the upfront costs. And I think upfront cost is expected to be the same for new petrol and new diesel cars in a few, I think it's 2024. So it's coming. But having said that, as I said, most people can't afford new cars because they're really expensive. So in terms of like how you can get, I think the best way that you can help people access all the benefits from electric cars, particularly in terms of like tax breaks, and you get free charging in some, no, sorry, free parking in some local authorities and stuff, is just through the secondhand market. So if we can increase the number of electric vehicles which are entering the secondhand market, that means way more people can benefit from them. So I think the best way that we can do that is the government mandating that like big fleets, commercial fleets and government fleets and business fleets go all electric, or a much higher percentage of electric vehicles, and then those will then pass through into the secondhand market once they've kind of reached the end of their useful life. But so yeah, that's what I think the government should be doing. At the moment, they do offer a grant, and it's called a plug-in vehicle grant. So you get £2,500 from the government, basically off the price of the car, the EV. And that's only for EVs under £50,000. Oh no, or is it 35? They've just recently changed it. I think it's now £35,000. So you do get a bit of a subsidy. But again, I'm kind of like, most people don't really spend that much money on a car. Like it's a lot of money, and that's a fairly small proportion of it. So I think for most normal people, it's like still fairly out of budget, unless like, you know, if you're a taxi driver or something, it might make sense, because actually lifetime costs matter more to you than if you're like if you just use it to like travel around. So yeah, I think at the moment it's still the benefits aren't really flowing to the wider population, apart from like in terms of air quality benefits and things like that. So really the government needs to be looking at increasing the secondhand market as fast as possible, so that more people can actually like enjoy using an EV. And
yeah, no, that's definitely a really good point. I think following that might be like good to discuss sort of, I think 2 points sort of following from that. Maybe like the environmental impact of producing EV, sort of linking to maybe like the question on lithium earlier, and EV use. So obviously it's better than petrol and diesel cars. But then on the other hand, we are still trying to reduce demand for travel, as you said earlier. So I think it might be good to like discuss that. And then I think it would also be really interesting for viewers if we talked a bit about like, you know, the fact that we still don't have clear ideas on how to reduce emissions from sources like aviation, shipping, HGVs, and other similar sources. So yeah, I thought we might be good to start with the environmental impact of producing EVs.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, because as I said, like the government is really keen on EVs, but they're not the whole part of the solution. But I think it's really interesting to look at like what we see. For example, there's this body called the Committee on Climate Change, which is the government's like independent advisory body on climate, and they look at all these different scenarios of how the UK can achieve its goal of 2050 being net zero emissions by 2050. And if you look at how the kind of emission savings they envisage from different types of, so for example, the EV transition, or like getting people to use public transport more, the absolutely biggest like emission savings are from electric vehicles. And that's because, I guess, even though we should be having demand reduction, a huge chunk of people will still be dependent on their cars to get around between different cities, to get to work, to, you know, go on holiday. There's lots of, so even though we really should be, as much as possible, trying to get people onto public transport, get people walking and cycling shorter distances, we will still need cars to some extent, and therefore like EVs are going to be a huge part of reaching those emissions targets. So I think, yeah, basically we need both, and it's just that the government's only focusing on EVs at the moment and much less on the demand reduction side. But yeah, I think, as I said, so I think we kind of need both. I hope that answered your question, actually. I'm not sure if I went off on a tangent.
That's absolutely fine. I think that was like a really, really useful answer. And I think other people will find it useful as well.
Cool. And then on to the bits that we don't know yet about how to decarbonize them. I guess it's really the kind of the big vehicles that we don't know at the moment how we're going to decarbonize. So things like aeroplanes or lorries and ships. And that's essentially because if you were going to use a battery on them, basically the battery would be so big that it just wouldn't make sense, because it would be too heavy to power them. So what you need is still having fuel, like a liquid fuel. So like, you know, petrol is a liquid fuel. You'd need something like that, but to something that's low carbon. So there's basically a number of different options, and there's a lot of controversy around some of them. So there's obviously biomass, is sort of bioenergy is a big one of them, and there's a lot of controversy around like how sustainable biofuels actually are, because a lot of them come from, I mean, you know, they could come from like palm oil in Indonesia, for example. They don't at the moment in the UK, but if we, you know, aviation fuels, for example, there are some groups lobbying to include palm oil in like sustainable fuels for aviation, which obviously would not be very sustainable. So like there basically needs to be a lot, like much stronger criteria around what like sustainable fuels actually means, and where they can come from. So yeah, there's biofuels. Then there's hydrogen is another version. So hydrogen, there's also hydrogen, could be like hydrogen buses and hydrogen cars as well, but they've sort of been outcompeted by electric vehicles at the moment. And then there's things like ammonia as well is another option, which actually is just a way of storing hydrogen, and then you kind of let the hydrogen out and it runs in the same way. So yeah, they're the options at the moment. It's just really around trying to make them work at scale, because they've never worked before other than in like really small like trials. So we kind of need to see them working on a really big scale, particularly for things like aviation. Like, yeah, we don't know what a hydrogen plane looks like. Similarly, we don't know what an electric plane looks like, or what an electric lorry looks like. So yeah, it's really about trying to scale up that technology and work out what makes sense kind of from a cost-effective point of view. And also with hydrogen as well, I mean, hydrogen is kind of seen as a bit of a panacea, I guess. Like for all the things that we don't know what the answer is, people, in terms of decarbonisation, people are like, oh, we can just use hydrogen, which is like, I think for some things, hydrogen is going to be really useful. But at the moment, the main way we make hydrogen is from natural gas, and that still produces emissions, and we have to still like bury those emissions to make sure that it doesn't add to climate change. So there's still big problems with hydrogen that need to be worked out before we like come to just being like, oh, this is going to be the solution to all our problems, basically. But yeah, but anyway, so basically all I'm saying is we don't know how we're going to decarbonise them yet, and there just needs to be a lot more work going on, which, to be fair, the government is like funding a lot of trials, and in fact there are trials going on all over the world because everyone's aware this is like massive problem. We want to keep flying as much as we are. How are we going to how are we going to do that?
News. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely promising news, and I think something that we should keep our eyes open for and see how it progresses, which is really good. I think we've got time for one last question, which I think is a really good one, and then we'll probably close off for today. So the last question is, a lot of money is being invested into long-term public sector projects, such as HS2. Is this justified, or could that money have been used elsewhere, for example, subsidizing EVs or current public transport?
Oh, that's a hard one. And a controversial one.
It's a controversial question.
I mean, this first HS2, the one they're building at the moment, I don't know how much that was needed necessarily, because it gets you a bit faster between Birmingham and London, but it's not like, sorry, is it Manchester and London? No, it's Birmingham and London. So it just gets you a bit faster. So it's not necessarily, I think it's like 10 minutes faster or something. So it's not necessarily that useful, I think. And it obviously had a big environmental impact on like some of the areas around. Maybe, but then again, like the second half, which kind of will much improve the transport links between cities in the north, I think that might be more useful. And I think it's actually a really hard question, because, and I think it's been really hard for lots of environmental activists, because on the one hand, like everyone's saying we need trains, we need more public transport, we need better, faster public transport, but also no one wants like ancient woodlands being ripped up for train lines. So it's actually, I mean, it has actually been it's been a long, long kind of live debate in the environmental sector. And yeah, I'd say from my personal point of view, like, yeah, the first bit is probably not that useful. Second bit, maybe more useful, just because of how bad the kind of transport infrastructure is in the north. But yeah, really good question, very hard question.
Yeah, it's one of those really big questions, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely something to think about, but it is a bit difficult to answer on the spot. So you did a really good job there. But yeah, no, that was a really good answer to the question. And I think that is all we have time for today. But it was so great chatting with you and hearing what you have to say. And I hope everyone watching the the call today learned a lot, because I certainly did.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and like great to see the work you're doing as well. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Then I think, yeah, so that's all we have time for today. And yeah, I hope everyone watching enjoyed this. And thank you for tuning in.